Did you see that piece by John Oliver in Last Week Tonight about trucks? Welcome back. So yesterday I was talking to a very good friend of mine, and he suggested I check out this piece in Last Week Tonight about the transportation industry, and it really focused on compensation in the life of being a truck driver. And it was a great piece. I'm going to throw that here in the show notes. I think everybody should have a chance to watch this and kind of feel the pressure that is under truck drivers every single day, all across the United States of America. The thing is that I go back to is it really was a good look at the symptoms of what's going on with our supply chain. It doesn't really touch on the real cause. And that leads me back to something I've talked about before. The greatest innovation in supply chain in the last 50 years. What was it? A legal designation. Independent contractor. Like most things, we have to look back at history to understand how we got to where we are. So often in supply chain, we focus on quarters or years, maybe even the last 5 years. But to really understand supply chain, you have to go back in the Wayback Machine to 1980 and to talk about a problem or a solution that was put together by Jimmy Carter. This thing was what caused what we now know as deregulation, the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. To understand how trucking worked back then, it was very regulated. Everything that you want to move had a price associated with it. Whether you were allowed to move that in a given area, again, was regulated. There were only a few carriers that could do most of the stuff that was happening. There wasn't this fragmentation that we see today, where there are hundreds of thousands of small carriers. It was highly consolidated, highly regulated, and highly unionized. So when we were looking to understand what would you do to reduce the cost, and this is a function of inflation. How do you get things delivered? Well, trucking is very expensive. Chances are 50% of the cost of a good happens in the final mile. So generally speaking, trucking moves everything. As John Oliver noted, 70% of all tonnage in the United States moves on a truck. And as time went on, the ability to move things more efficiently with the Motor Carrier Act allowed an explosion of small carriers and different types of trucking organizations. So example, in 1980 versus 1990, there were over 40,000 new motor carriers. So what ends up being the case, is what Jimmy Carter promised when he signed this law, was that there might be a savings of up to $8 billion with a B every year in the cost of moving goods. Now, $8 billion in 1980 is a lot of money. What does that look like today? Well, it's about $27 billion. So the idea of owner-operators, the idea of being able to take a risk of owning a truck, of operating the truck, maintaining the truck, fueling the truck, was something that you really couldn't outsource. You didn't have that ability. But with deregulation, you certainly could. And honestly, this is what my father saw. My father grew up in the industry. He was working for Roadway in 1976. Back in those days, there were really three carriers that mattered. There was Roadway, there was Yellow, and there was CF, Consolidated Freight. These were heavily unionized companies that did most of the LTL work in the United States. But as Dad went through the business, things changed. He spent most of his career with Roadway, and then he moved on to Airborne, which later was acquired by DHL. What made Airborne so interesting was they were capitalizing on this trend of deregulation. So the drivers who were making deliveries were often owner-operators or independent contractors, and the maintenance that was provided was done by third parties. You would manage the maintenance of someone outside of you. And when you outsource, the whole point is you want someone who can do it better than you, or as good as you, but more affordably. And that's what outsourced fleet services was. My father started his company in 1991. We were the largest provider of maintenance for a company called RPS, the division that eventually, RPS was Roadway Package Systems, that eventually became FedEx Ground. So the idea that John Oliver talked about, that the drivers who come to your house from FedEx or the drivers who come to your house from Amazon, these are not employees of those organizations. Now, I want to be very careful here. I love truck drivers. Many friends of mine are drivers or small carriers that work in different aspects of the supply chain. You guys do the hardest job in the world. It is dangerous, it is difficult, and it is not for the faint of heart. But as John Oliver's piece explained, was that so many drivers aren't seeing that value. And I've talked about this before. If you look at the average compensation for a truck driver in 1980, it was about $38,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's well over $100,000 a year. Today, over-the-road truck drivers might hit around 50, 60, they might hit more than that, but they have to take into account every aspect of running a trucking company. And those aspects are very, very challenging. So the biggest expense you have in over-the-road trucking, or really any trucking, is fuel. That's the biggest expense. Second biggest expense is labor. The third biggest expense is the asset itself, the truck and the trailer. The fourth spend is a little bit lower down the totem pole, but that's maintenance. Then you have tires and insurance and all these other things. When you have owner-operators and you have this model, what ends up happening is you have taken that burden, that risk from you, and you've given it to somebody else. That's what those lease purchase agreements are talked about in John Oliver's piece. These are very dangerous arrangements where a person will say, hey, I'd love to be a business owner. Can you let me borrow your equipment that I will pay for, maintain, and take care of? And hopefully you'll provide me enough profitable loads that can make me a good living. So I love when people talk about trucking. I hope that people take John Oliver's work and they run with it and they say, let's find out more about this. It cannot be the case that we just live in this situation where it is impossible to make a living in some cases with essential work. That $8 billion savings annually in 1980 came at a price. And that price was the cost that you pay for a driver. We changed the business model of having enough stuff in your warehouse that you can then bring out to market to a just-in-time setup, where you are ordering things from somewhere far, far away, and it is walking through a supply chain across the globe, getting here for just-in-time fulfillment. The ability to outsource transportation is not new, and it's not bad, but it is important to understand how that impacts what we see today. That idea that there is a driver shortage is a fallacy. Honestly, it is. You talk to the biggest private fleets, or you talk to the largest for-hire carriers that have, whether they're less than truckload or even some of the dedicated folks, they don't have the churn rate that we see in other parts of the industry. Driver churn in many parts of the business is anywhere from 80 to 120% annually. You hire 10, you lose 12. That is a broken, dysfunctional system. The job of being a truck driver is important and awesome and important for everybody who's involved with everything. You don't get to opt out of the supply chain. However, if we don't make efforts to make being a driver a more compelling profession, we are going to be at a loss. We will suffer because we will not be able to move goods the way we want to. Ultimately, the cost to deliver things is not free. If it says that it is, it's not true. Someone pays that cost. And I urge people to understand the Motor Carrier Act of 1980. I'll throw the Wikipedia in there. That's at least a good primer to understand. Many of the people that I have had a chance to work with over the years were the people that grew up with my father in the industry. 1970s, 80s. They're not on LinkedIn. They're not on YouTube. They're not on some of these things. So if you know people that are in this business that have been in here for a while, oh my gosh, the number one thing you should do is talk to them. Ask them, what was it like? How did you move things effectively? How did you control maintenance? What was your truck to trailer ratio? How did you find loads? These are things that are very interesting, and you should learn about them if you can. So check out the video from John Oliver. Again, I really appreciate my friends who have said, hey, you should check this out. And understand that what we see today is not a bug in our system, not a bug in the supply chain. It's a feature. This was the anticipated consequence, or at the very least, a natural consequence of deregulating the industry and allowing the greatest innovation of all time, the rise of the owner-operator. As always, I appreciate you for following me, for listening to me, for enjoying the content that I put up. This is almost at 10 minutes. I got to stop it now. Have a great day.